Okay, hi everyone. This is just a very short video. I only have 4 slides. Just kind of wrapping up what we just talked about in terms of literature slash myth and what the archaeology is showing us and what it can tell us about the formation of the early Roman state. Some of this we've already looked at. So when you look at the archaeology, you can find various things like, I mentioned the Romans kind of dividing off special areas called the Pomerium, which I didn't mention in the last video, but it was written on the slide. Um, this was an area where troops could not enter. Now, we'll see throughout Roman history, sometimes troops do enter this and it causes lots of issues, but they are big enough to do something like this. We do find as they are building up, a lot of these buildings are wood, not so much stone until a little bit later. There's evidence of flooding because of the Tiber, despite the fact of having a sewer system built that drains away all the water. You've got evidence of fires, flooding, and so on. And again, think of the 20 to 25 feet below the surface. When they have fires or floods, the buildings collapse, and sometimes instead of reusing material, they will build on top of it and build on top of it and so on. I've already mentioned the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. You have other temples to other gods and goddesses, Diana, Castor and Pollux, and so on. So religion is becoming a very important thing to Romans during this particular time period. And I mentioned in the last lecture on archaeology about the stone houses. So people are now starting to build regular stone houses on these hills. And again, this is probably showing us a little bit about the divisions in society between the poor, who probably can't build stone houses, and the rich who can. I mentioned a few things about Etruscan influences, and I mentioned this also when we did a lecture last week on the Etruscans. So you have lots of influences on the Romans, temple shape, religious ideas. Um, does this indicate Etruscan kings? So it may or may not. That's a really good question. Sometimes we have very little archaeology to go on in terms of answering a question like that. And then we had to look at the literature. And Livy mentioned some of the Etruscans becoming kings and so on. So maybe there were Etruscan kings, maybe not. It's hard to really tell. Okay, so how do we mix these up? Or how do we think about them in terms of myth slash literature and what the archaeology is showing? So, I mean, some of kind of the big questions, which probably can't really be answered, is what is true? So we have these stories about Romulus and Remus and the rape and abduction of the Sabine women and the rape of Lucretia. What is true? Well, that is a really good question. I think that's part of the fun of being um, involved in history and the creation of history. It's almost up to you to decide what is true and what is not based on evidence. So we have literature that says these stories were true. What historians and archaeologists try and do is they look at the archaeology to see if we can find something. If you can't, that might tell you something about the archaeology. Um, and if you can, that's great to find something that can tie in, like, this hut, which is traditionally the house of Romulus, ties in with a story that we find in Livy and others. Does it matter whether it's true or not? Well, I think it does, definitely. But a lot of times you can't answer that question definitely. So what you just have to say is it's probably true because the Romans believed that it was, and these stories are conservative. We've got the archaeology to back up some of it, but not all of it, and then you have to make the determination on your own. Certainly, it was important to the Romans because this is their history. Um, if they read the material by Livy or it was read to them, they certainly know a little bit about their history based on literature. They did look at some archaeology. I mean, they could look around and see these old buildings that are standing and then know some of the stories. Now, what did it mean to later Romans? Again, probably the same thing. They were very proud of their history, and their history made a big impact on the way that they developed their culture. So there's a lot of interesting things that we can look at by looking at both the literature that we have, that of course was written hundreds of years after the fact, and the archaeology, which is the material that was in the area, built in the area that the time period we're studying, and trying to figure out how these two can mix and what it can tell us about history.